The Grand Convention Hall in San Francisco was buzzing with excitement. Every chair was filled. Journalists, CEOs, and political leaders from around the world were gathered under the warm lights. The Global Technology and Leadership Summit was about to begin. Banners swayed gently, announcing a new era of cooperation between governments and the tech industry. People whispered with anticipation, but there was tension too unspoken. Sharp like glass hidden under silk. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, was attending as the keynote guest. He had been invited to speak about India's growth in technology and digital infrastructure. For many in the room, especially from the Western world, Modi was a symbol of ambition, of a rising new order. For others, he was still misunderstood, and some did not hide their discomfort. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, sat 3 rows back. He wore a soft gray suit and kept his hands folded. His eyes were focused, calm, watching every movement on stage. Beside him sat his mother, Lakshmi Pichai, dressed in a simple sari, her face glowing with quiet pride. Behind them were global influencers, billionaires, and former presidents. As the host stepped onto the stage and welcomed the audience, a low hush fell over the room. And then came the announcement. Please welcome to the stage, the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. There was polite applause. Some stood to show respect, but not everyone. On the left side of the hall, a small group of executives remained, seated. One of them, a known venture capitalist, crossed his arms and whispered loudly enough for nearby cameras to catch. Let's see if he talks about cows again. A few chuckled. Another followed, or maybe he'll explain how became government policy. Sundar's jaw tightened. Modi walked toward the podium with grace. He paused for a moment, scanning the room. He noticed. He always noticed, but he said nothing. He simply smiled as he began to speak. His words were calm, measured, full of depth. I do not come here to teach. I come to learn, and I come to share. The room listened, but the air was uneasy. Those whispers, those insults grew like cracks in a wall. The camera feed showed everything. The smirks, the eye rolls. It became too clear to ignore. And Sundar saw his mother lower her eyes. Lakshmi Pichai had taught her son to be proud, but never proud of pride. She had taught him that silence, when chosen with dignity, could be louder than any speech. But even she felt the sting of disrespect aimed not just at a leader, but at a nation. Sundar stood up. He did not walk toward the stage. He walked out of the hall. People noticed. Reporters took note. Live tweets began to buzz. Why did Sundar Pichai leave? What happened? Is he angry? But Sundar was not angry. He walked out to breathe. Outside the hall, the sky was clear. California's sun touched the glass walls. He called his assistant. Get me a 5-minute slot on the second panel, he said. The assistant hesitated. It's packed, sir. Make it happen, Sundar said. And make sure my mother is seated in the front row. Then he turned and looked at the distant hills. Behind those hills was a country he never forgot. He had walked its narrow roads as a boy. He had fixed bulbs in his small Chennai home. He had waited outside public libraries for a chance to read. And now he was here, and something had to be said. Not in anger, but with grace. Back in the hall, Modi was wrapping up his speech. He had spoken about digital India, about the youth who code by candlelight, about startups from villages that now serve millions. He spoke about resilience, not revenge. As he left the podium, there was warm applause. Some stood, some clapped reluctantly, and the group who mocked him, they laughed under their breath. They were not laughing for long. After a coffee break, the host returned to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, we have a brief unscheduled message from a man who needs no introduction. Please welcome the CEO of Google, Mr. Sundar Pichai. The room went still. The group of executives who had mocked earlier looked uneasy. Sundar walked slowly. his expression unreadable, but his eyes were clear, firm, and steady. He took the mic. He said nothing for 10 seconds, and then he began. When I was a child in India, he said, my father and I would wait months to afford a train ticket. We shared one newspaper, one bulb, one fan. We didn't dream of Silicon Valley. We dreamed of a better lunch. People chuckled lightly, but Sundar didn't smile. He continued, today, I sit on stages like these, and I see faces that, once only, existed in books and screens. But what I see most is not power. It is responsibility, a shift in the room. This morning, when our honored guest walked on stage, I heard laughter. I heard jokes that don't just insult a man, they insult every child who still walks those dusty roads I once walked. The hall fell silent. Leaders don't need your agreement, but they deserve your basic respect. Especially when they stand here not for personal gain, but to speak for over 1 billion voices. He paused. You may not agree with every policy. That is your right. But mockery is not intelligence. It is weakness in disguise. The crowd was frozen. Sundar looked at his mother in the front row. My mother taught me something, he said. She said, even when others throw stones, carry flowers. Not to please them, but to remind yourself who you are. He smiled gently. Today, I carry a flower, and I offer it in honor of a man who carries the weight of one of the world's oldest civilizations. He turned toward the audience. If we cannot respect that, then maybe we are not as global as we think. There was no applause yet, just silence, and then one person stood up, an African diplomat, then another, and another, until the whole hall rose. The very air changed, and the group that mocked, they sat frozen, quiet, and Sundar Pichai walked off the stage without waiting for applause, because sometimes dignity walks louder than noise, and that day Grace wore a suit and glasses, and it changed the room. News of Sundar Pichai's short but powerful speech spread like wildfire. Within an hour, clips flooded social media. Within 3, they were being translated into over 20 languages. Within 6 hours, headlines in India read, Sundar Pichai stands tall, teaches the world a lesson in respect. Tech CEO defends India with quiet strength. When Modi was mocked, Sundar chose dignity over silence. But far away from the cameras and lights, in a quiet corner of Delhi, an old teacher named Mr. Ramachandran was watching the video on his daughter's phone. He had taught both English and values in a small government school. He was now retired. His back slightly bent, but his eyes were still sharp. He wiped his glasses and turned to his wife. See this boy, he said, voice trembling with emotion. I once told my students, respect is not something you demand, it's something you carry. Today, this boy carried it for an entire nation. In a tiny village in Tamil Nadu, a teenage boy named Arjun sat outside a tea stall, watching the same clip. His phone screen cracked, audio a little fuzzy, but the message came through loud and clear. He stared at the screen as Sundar Pichai spoke about walking dusty roads and dreaming of lunch. Arjun whispered to himself, he talks like he's one of us. And that line stuck in his head. He's one of us. In that moment, Sundar was no longer just the CEO of Google. He was Arjun's elder brother. He was Mr. Ramachandran's proud student. He was Lakshmi Pichai's quiet son. He was every Indian who had ever felt small in a big room, but still chose to stand tall. Back in San Francisco, Narendra Modi had already returned to his hotel. The night was quiet, and he sat alone, watching the video of Sundar's speech. He did not show emotion, but as the screen dimmed, he closed his eyes and whispered a line from an old Indian poem. Those who speak without anger speak longest. His secretary knocked gently on the door. Sir, he said, you've received over 1,000 messages in the last hour. Many from global leaders. Some are apologizing. Modi simply nodded. And Sundar Pichai, he asked. He's returned. Home, sir. Declined all interviews. Said he didn't do it for cameras. Modi smiled faintly. Of course he didn't, he said. He did it for something bigger. The next morning, things began to change. A journalist who had laughed during the panel tweeted an apology. A tech investor who had mocked Modi posted a long message saying, "I learned something about leadership yesterday from someone who didn't raise his voice." And one of the organizers of the summit personally called Modi's team to express regret and promised to review how future events would be handled. But Sundar remained silent. He went back to work. He held meetings, visited a startup incubator, answered emails, and politely declined every media request that came his way. "Your words are trending," his assistant told him. "Let the words work," he replied. "I don't need to." But while he stayed quiet, his mother watched everything. She sat by the window of their guest apartment, her hands folded around a warm cup of chai. Reporters had tried to reach her, but she had gently refused them all, except one. A small student news group from Chennai requested an interview. Lakshmi agreed. The interview was simple. The reporter asked, "What did you feel when Sundar stood up that day?" Lakshmi paused for a long time. Then she said, "I did not raise him to win arguments. I raised him to win hearts." Those words became the second wave. They spread just like Sundar's speech had. And this time, it wasn't just about politics or pride. It was about parenting. It was about kindness. A famous radio host shared the interview and said, "This mother deserves a standing ovation." Celebrities began reposting it with captions like "Parenting goals" and "Humility begins at home." Schools across India played both Sundar's speech and Lakshmi's interview during morning assembly. A principal in Mumbai told his students, "Every now and then, the world reminds us that intelligence without humility is noise. But humility with intelligence, that's music." And people listened. But not everyone was happy. In a corner office, in a shiny San Francisco skyscraper, the same tech investors who had laughed during Modi's speech sat around a long table. One of them, a bald man with silver glasses, tapped his fingers. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "We're being painted as villains." Another said, "It's just social media. It'll fade." A third added, "But the board is asking questions. Sponsors too. We underestimated how people see him." They all knew who him meant. Sundar Pichai had not raised his voice, but his grace had become louder than anything they had ever tweeted. And now, they had a choice to make. But before they could decide, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at Sundar's office, and sealed. It wasn't from a politician. It wasn't from a corporation. It was from a girl named Simran in Kanpur. Inside was a drawing of Sundar holding a flower and standing in front of a big room. Below it, written in uneven handwriting, were these words, "Dear Sundar uncle, thank you for not shouting. Thank you for showing that respect is stronger than fear. When I grow up, I want to be kind like you." Sundar read the letter twice. Then he walked to the window, outside. A soft breeze moved the trees. He smiled, held the letter close to his heart, and whispered, "This is why." He turned to his assistant. "Cancelled the interview with the big network," he said. "But sir, they're offering a global slot." "Tell them," he said, "I've already been heard." And in homes across India, people sat around dinner tables and talked not about scandals or arguments, but about a man who stood without shouting, who walked without pushing, who reminded them that grace is not weakness. It is strength that refuses to become loud. In the following days, the world continued to move. As always, flights took off. Deals were made, and meetings filled calendars. But something had shifted in the hearts of many. The moment Sundar Pichai had stood up, without anger, without shouting, had not just passed it, had planted something in classrooms across India. Teachers paused between math lessons to talk about dignity. In homes, parents showed their children how strength did not always come from the loudest voice. And in offices, Young professionals looked at their own behavior and asked quietly, what would Sundar have done? Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a high-level roundtable on tech leadership had just begun. The panel included leaders from Facebook, Microsoft, Tesla, and Google. Sundar arrived quietly, as he always did. But this time, when he entered the room, everyone stood. No words, just respect. An American senator, who had once criticized India's policies, stepped forward and said, I may not agree with every position, but after last week, I agree on one thing: grace is more powerful than noise. Sundar nodded politely. He spoke little, but when he did, people leaned in. We're not just building systems, he said. We're building how people see each other. His words were short, but they landed deep, far away, in the heart of Gujarat. Modi's hometown was celebrating, not with parades, not with noise, but with small acts. Children painted posters saying, speak with respect. A librarian created a section called Books. Sundar would read. Even the local chaiwala named a new special blend after Sundar. He called it Grace Chai. But not all voices were kind. On a late-night show in New York, a comedian made a joke about the incident. Guess the tech guys got emotional over a flower, he said, chuckling that the audience laughed. But the next day, something unusual happened. Hundreds of letters poured into the network office. Not angry letters, but thoughtful ones. One read, Dear Sir, there are many ways to be funny. Mocking dignity isn't one of them. Another read, We teach our children not to laugh at those who stand up with kindness. Maybe it's time we adults learned the same. Even a few sponsors quietly pulled their ads. The network issued a soft apology on their website, and the comedian, he posted a short video saying, I got it wrong. Sundar, respect. The ripple was growing at Google's headquarters. Things were quiet on the surface, but deep inside, teams began to talk about using technology, not just for speed, but for social change. Sundar called a meeting with the diversity and inclusion team. How do we build tools, he asked, that teach kindness as well as connection? No one had an answer right away, but something had started. That afternoon, Sundar visited a local school in the Bay Area. No cameras, no reporters, just him in a room full of 10-year-olds. He sat on a tiny chair and listened as children shared what they wanted to become. A girl said, I want to be a pilot. A boy whispered, I want to be a poet. Another girl raised her hand. I want to be like you, she said. Sundar smiled softly. You already are, he replied. You speak kindly, you listen, and you think before you act. That's leadership. Outside the classroom, the principal told Sundar that the parents of those children had all written in after the summit speech. You reminded them, she said, that what we do in boardrooms begins in living rooms. That evening, as Sundar returned home, he found Lakshmi sitting by the window again. She looked at him and said, You're becoming quieter these days. He nodded. Noise is easy. Silence needs strength. She smiled. Your father would be proud, she said. And you? He asked. I already was, she replied. Meanwhile, at a summit in Singapore, Narendra Modi spoke again. This time, when he entered the hall, he was welcomed with a standing ovation, not just from Indian delegates, but from people of many nations. In his speech, he did not mention the incident, but he did say this: when someone chooses silence over revenge, they are not surrendering. They are choosing a higher road. And sometimes, the higher road leads not to applause, but to hearts. Backstage, an aide handed Modi a small gift box. Inside was a single flower. A note read, from one walker of the higher road to another. There was no signature, but Modi knew. The ripple had reached him, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by policy papers and flashing cameras, he smiled the kind of smile that comes not from victory, but from being understood. The story wasn't just Sundar's anymore. It belonged to everyone who ever felt mocked, underestimated, or spoken over and still chose to respond with dignity. And that choice was changing the world. A week after Sundar Pichai's quiet stand changed the world's tone, something unexpected happened. People had listened. People had respected. But now people wanted to act. It began with a simple post from a young coder in Bangalore. He wrote, "I was mocked during a job interview because of my accent. I stayed silent. I remembered Sundar's grace. I got the job the next day." Within hours, others started sharing their own stories. The hashtag stand with grace began to trend. It wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about countries. It was about people choosing respect, even when they had every reason to fight. A woman in London shared, "I held back tears in a meeting where they ignored my idea. I smiled, repeated myself calmly. Later, my boss called me to say it changed her view." A boy from Kenya posted, "I walk miles to attend school. Sometimes, people laugh at my shoes. Today, I walked proudly." Sundar's story reminded me that my walk matters. Meanwhile, Sundar remained silent. No posts, no speeches, no interviews. He was in India. He had taken a short trip, unannounced. No media followed him. No one even knew where he had gone except a few close staff members and his mother. He was in Chennai, one early morning. Before the city stirred, Sundar walked the same narrow streets where he grew up. He passed the rusted gate of his childhood home. The walls were smaller than he remembered. The air smelled like jasmine and old rain. An old woman sweeping outside recognized him. "Sundar," she gasped. He smiled. "Vanakkam, auntie." Within minutes, a few neighbors gathered, but he kept it simple. "Just visiting old memories," he said. One little boy stepped forward. He had a notebook in his hand and dirt on his face. "Are you the man who gave the flower?" he asked. Sundar knelt down. "Yes," he said. "My Oma said you taught the world something big, that we can win without shouting." The boy said, "Your Uma is right," Sundar replied. Then he did something small but unforgettable. He pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote in the boy's notebook, "Be proud, be kind, be true." The boy held the notebook like it was gold. Word spread quickly. A local reporter caught wind of Sundar's visit. By noon, a small article appeared in a Chennai blog. Google CEO returns to his roots quietly, leaves behind a message of kindness. The article made its way back to Silicon Valley, in the office where those executives had once mocked Modi. Things were changing. Emails were more polite. Meetings started with acknowledgments. One of the very men who had made the first joke about cows now sat in silence during a staff call. After the meeting, he called his assistant. "Get me the name of that school in India." Sundar visited, he said. "Why, sir?" the assistant asked. "I want to fund their tech lab," he replied. "That's very generous," she said. "No," he said. "It's overdue." In Washington, the senator who once doubted India's digital future proposed a new joint initiative between us and Indian tech students, called the Grace Project. Their first event, a debate on power through silence. Across oceans and borders, seeds were growing. In Singapore, Narendra Modi received a call from a world leader who had remained distant for years. "You taught us something," the leader said. "I only spoke softly," Modi replied. "Sometimes that's what the world hears loudest," came the answer. Back in Chennai, Sundar and his mother walked through the local temple. As they walked, Lakshmi whispered, "You remember what I told you when you got your first job?" Sundar smiled. "Yes," you said. "Carry your shoes with your heart, not your head." She laughed. "I meant don't let them get too big." They both laughed, walking past a row of children feeding birds. But even in the laughter, Sundar remained thoughtful. "Oma," he said, "do you think people will forget this?" Lakshmi stopped and looked at him. "Maybe," she said, "but someone else will remember. And when their time comes, they'll choose the higher road." Sundar looked up at the sky. Then maybe that's enough, he whispered. Later that evening, he received a letter, not digital, not typed, handwritten, with careful curves and soft ink. It was from an old classmate, someone who had once told Sundar he would never amount to much. The letter read, "Dear Sundar, I used to think success meant money and status. I now see it means dignity. Thank you for teaching me. I'm sorry for the way I once spoke to you. I hope we meet again not as rivals, but as friends." Sundar folded the letter and placed it beside the flower he had carried that day in San Francisco. He did not reply with words, but in his next team meeting, he made an announcement. "I want to start a small internal program," he said. Space where our team members can share lessons they learned, not from books, but from their lives. Moments of grace, of silence, of turning points. One young engineer raised her hand. "Sir," she said, "will we get time during office hours for that?" Sundar smiled. "Some things," he said, "are more important than office hours." And in that small decision, another wave began. One that didn't need trending hashtags, because kindness doesn't need to be viral to be powerful. 2 weeks after Sundar Pichai gave that flower of respect to the world, something happened that no one expected. A global leaders summit was announced in New York. It was to bring together not only political figures, but also tech giants, youth, innovators, environmental activists, and educators from more than 50 countries. The theme was simple: the future of humanity depends on the values we choose today. It was an event where every speaker mattered, and this time, Sundar Pichai and Narendra Modi were both on the guest list, but they were not listed as speakers. They were listed as witnesses. The summit organizers had decided something bold. For the first time, the event would feature a live story circle. Real people, students, parents, workers. Teachers would share short true stories about the power of grace, resilience, and respect. And one seat in the circle would be saved for someone special. A little girl from Kanpur.Simran. The same girl who had written Sundar a letter weeks ago. The organizers had read her words. "Thank you for not shouting. Thank you for showing that respect is stronger than fear." They invited her, and she said yes. The moment she entered the hall, holding her father's hand and wearing a simple blue dress with white flowers, every camera turned, but she did not notice. Her eyes searched for one person, Sundar Pichai. He was already seated in the front row, next to Lakshmi, his mother. When he saw her, he stood up. Simran ran forward and hugged him. She whispered, "I brought my notebook." He smiled, knelt down, and said, "Then today, you will write history in it." The story circle began. A teenager from South Africa shared how he faced racism at school, but chose to respond with patience, teaching instead of shouting. A woman from Peru spoke about losing her job because she refused to lie, and how her honesty led her to a better place. An old farmer from Punjab told how he once stopped a neighbor from being beaten during a protest by simply stepping in and saying, "This is not who we are." Each story echoed with truth, but when Simran stood up, the hall went completely quiet. Even Modi leaned forward. She walked to the center, notebook in hand, and spoke with soft courage. "I am just a girl," she began, "but I saw something. I saw a man stand up, not with fists, not with anger, but with a flower." She turned slightly toward Sundar. He didn't raise his voice, but he raised many hearts. Her words were simple, but people listened as if every syllable was gold. "When I go to school now," she said, "my friends don't laugh at mistakes. They help. Our teacher says we're building something stronger than marks. We're building character." She paused, then added, "And all because one man reminded us that silence is not weakness." The hall stood up before she even finished. Standing ovation. Sundar wiped a tear gently. So did Lakshmi, and even Modi, whose eyes rarely revealed emotion. looked away for a moment, his face softened by something that felt like pride. After the circle ended, Simran was handed a small glass trophy, but she turned and held it out to Sundar. "This is yours," she said. He shook his head. "No," he said, "this is ours." Modi walked forward then. The room held its breath. There was no speech scheduled, but sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that are not planned. Modi looked at Simran and Sundar. Then he turned to the room and said, "We often speak about progress as speed, as growth, as power. But today I learned something new from a child and a CEO. Progress is when we become bigger in heart, not just in data." He placed his hand gently on Simran's head. "You are the future," he said. Then he turned to Sundar. "And you, my friend, are the bridge." Those words echoed, that image of a prime minister, a tech CEO, and a little girl holding a notebook spread across the world in minutes. The headline read, "When 3 generations stood together, the world listened." Back in Chennai, in the small street where Sundar grew up, kids painted a mural on a wall. It showed a flower in the center, surrounded by soft blue waves, and beside it, in Tamil and English, it read, "Be proud, be kind, be true." The same words Sundar had once written in Simran's notebook, and now those words were being written in hearts all across the globe. In New Delhi, government officials proposed a new education campaign. They called it Grace in Action. Its goal, to teach respect, listening, and thoughtful speech in schools across the country. In Silicon Valley, companies began discussing adding empathy workshops to their leadership training. And even that same comedy show which had once mocked Sundar, they invited Simran for a guest segment. And this time, the joke was on them. The host smiled sheepishly and said, "Sometimes, the world needs a girl with a notebook to remind us how to behave." The audience clapped, not because they were told to, but because they felt it. Later that night, Sundar stood alone on the balcony of his apartment in New York. The city lights blinked like stars below. Behind him, his mother prepared tea. Beside him, Simran's notebook lay open. He picked it up and wrote just one more line. "The world does not always change when you speak. Sometimes, it changes when you choose not to." And in that quiet night, under the same sky that watched over Kanpur, Chennai, and San Francisco, the world paused for just a moment, and it felt kinder. 3 months had passed since the summit in New York. The world had moved on, as it always does. New headlines came. New challenges arose. But deep beneath the rush of daily news, the ripples from that moment, the flower, the silence, the girl, with the notebook still moved quietly through lives. In Chennai, a new school curriculum had begun. Every Monday, students would share what they called grace moments. Stories of respect, acts of kindness. Teachers noticed a change. Students started helping one another more. Bullies were fewer. Conversations became softer. In San Francisco, at Google's headquarters, a special room was created. Not a tech lab, not a boardroom. A quiet space filled with soft light, simple chairs, and a wall that read, "When words fail, grace speaks." The idea came from Sundar, but he had already moved on to something else. He was planning a return not to a stage, or a summit, or a screen but home. This time, it was different. Sundar Pichai had received an invitation from the Indian president. A special national honor was to be presented, not for technology, not for economic growth, but for preserving the spirit of India in silence. Lakshmi smiled when she read the letter. She placed it gently next to her small prayer lamp. "He did nothing loud," she said, "but it echoed far." The day of the ceremony arrived. Delhi was glowing. The presidential hall was full. Dignitaries, teachers, scientists, social workers, and artists all gathered in white and gold. Modi stood beside the president, and when Sundar walked up to receive the medal, the crowd did not cheer loudly. They simply stood up, in full silence, and it felt louder than thunder. Modi handed Sundar the medal. For a moment, their eyes met. No words, just mutual understanding. After the ceremony, a private dinner was held. Sundar sat quietly at a long table with leaders and thinkers. Simran was there too, this time in a blue dress with gold patterns. She sat between her parents, holding the same notebook. During dessert, the president stood and raised a toast. To the man who reminded us, he said, that leadership is not just about action, it is about restraint. As the guests clapped, Sundar stood up. He had not planned to speak. He hadn't written anything, but something stirred inside him. He looked around the room, then he began. I am often asked, he said, how to succeed. People expect answers about coding, business, vision, but today, I will share something else. He paused. I succeeded, he said, because my mother taught me not to reply with anger when insulted, because a child in Kanpur reminded me that silence is not weakness, because my country forgave the ones who laughed. He took a breath. We are not a perfect world. We are not perfect people. But if we can teach one another that kindness can walk next to confidence, then we have already won. The room stood again, this time in applause. But even as they clapped, Sundar sat down quietly. Later that night, in his room, Sundar opened Simran's notebook again. She had written something. New. It said, when the world gets too loud, remember the man who made it quiet again. He smiled, and for the first time in months, he wrote something new on the next page. You don't need to raise your voice to rise. A few days later, Sundar and his mother flew back to Chennai. There were no press cameras at the airport, no red carpets. Just one auto driver who recognized him and said, Anna, you made us proud. Sundar nodded and got in quietly. As they drove past the old library where he once stood in line for books, he looked out and whispered, it's still here. Lakshmi replied, so is your silence. At home, he placed the medal not in a safe, but beside a framed drawing, the one Simran had sent him, of the flower and the room full of people. And then, just as the sun began to set, he stepped out into the street, where children played, where women dried clothes, and where an old man sat reading the newspaper. No one rushed him, no one asked for selfies, because in that neighborhood, he was not the CEO, he was Sundar. And Sundar smiled at a boy walking barefoot and said, what are you going to be when you grow up? The boy shrugged. Maybe a teacher, maybe a pilot. I don't know. Sundar knelt and said, whatever you become, just remember, speak less, mean more. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but one day, he would. Because the story of grace was not ending, it was beginning in new voices, new hands, and new hearts. In offices where people now paused before replying harshly. In schools, where teachers now taught silence as strength. In homes, where parents now reminded their children, be like Sundar. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't. And that was how Sundar Pichai's quiet stand against noise, against mockery, against ego became a movement without slogans, without banners, only a flower, only a choice, and the world had chosen to follow. Years passed. The story of that day in San Francisco became a case study in universities, not about business, not about politics, but about character. The flower moment, they called it. It was taught in schools as a lesson in leadership. It was studied in leadership seminars under the chapter, Power Without Volume, but Sundar Pichai, now older, quieter, and even more respected, rarely spoke about it. He didn't need to. The world had already learned what it needed. He had returned to India, permanently, not to run Google from afar, not to start a political journey, but to teach. Yes, Sundar Pichai, once CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world, had become a visiting professor at a small, lesser-known college near Chennai. His class was not about coding, it was about choices, Every Monday, students gathered in a circle under a neem tree outside the classroom. No laptops, no cameras, just notebooks. He would begin each session with a question, never with a lecture. One day he asked, "What do you do when the world mocks you?" A girl answered, "You prove them wrong." Sundar shook his head. "No," he said, "you proved yourself right." The class went silent. That was the magic. He didn't just speak to teach. He spoke to make people pause. Meanwhile, Simran, now a teenager, had started her own podcast. It was called The Notebook. Every week, she invited people from small towns, remote villages, and forgotten communities to share one story where they chose kindness over anger. Her tagline was simple: speak less, mean more. Her first guest, not a celebrity, not a politician, a local bus driver from Kanpur who once stopped his bus for an old woman in the rain and gave her his only umbrella. No one saw it, he said, but it felt right. Simran smiled. "And now, the world knows," she replied. Across the world, movements were born, not in protests, not in revolutions, but in classrooms, in kitchens, in ordinary offices. A movement of listening, a movement of mindful replies. Companies introduced Grace Hour, a weekly time to reflect, forgive, and grow. Schools added empathy sessions in their timetable, and in a tiny museum in Chennai, a new exhibit was opened. At the center was a simple flower, not real, not plastic, carved out of wood. Beside it was a plaque that read, "This flower stopped a storm." On opening day, Sundar stood at the back of the room. He said nothing. A visitor approached him unknowingly and said, "They say this is about some moment in tech history. Do you know more?" Sundar smiled. "A little," he said, but he didn't add more. He let silence speak, and it did. Years later, at a World Education Summit, Simran, now grown up, leading a global youth platform, was invited to speak. When she came to the stage, people expected big speeches, but all she said was, "One man stood quietly, and the world heard him louder than thunder." Then she held up a notebook, the same one from years ago. "We don't need more noise," she said. "We need more meaning." And the crowd stood not in applause but in stillness, a silence so deep it hummed with truth. After the summit, an old man walked slowly toward her. Tall, gray hair, glasses, gentle hands. "Sundar." He hugged her, gently. "You passed it on," he whispered. She smiled, tears in her eyes. "I just followed the path you lit," she replied. And as they stood together, two people connected not by blood, but by belief. The world saw something rare. Not fame, not power, just quiet. Greatness. A reminder that respect is a choice, that kindness is a voice, and that even in the loudest world, a flower offered with dignity can bloom louder than any word. This is where the story ends, not in noise, but in silence that changed the world.